Thank you, Ajay, and all the best to all the people that have come to discuss this very important matter on the issues of school closure. I think the whole Right to Education Act and also the conditions of schooling, and whether it is school level or higher education level, I think these are particular concerns, and we do not seem to be really doing anything to improve the conditions of schools of higher education or school level education. In this whole thing, I think one particular issue that has come of much concern in the last year, in 2014 particularly, has been the government decision to close government schools. Approximately Outlook did a study, and they found about almost 100,000 schools being closed across many states. Just to give a little bit of the numbers of these schools, Rajasthan, about 17,000 schools were closed. Gujarat, about 13,000 schools were closed. Maharashtra, also about 13,000 schools were closed. I think Telangana had about 4,000 schools, Andhra 5,000, Karnataka 12,000, and I think many other states, Madhya Pradesh 3,500, Tamil Nadu, which is like come forward in study education, they also have been closing their schools. So the big question is then, what is the reason behind this government's closing these schools, and at such a wide level across states? It's not like one state is closing schools, but across the country you are having many states closing their school, which surely shows that there is an overall understanding, or there is an overall plan of the national level of closing down schools. Now, why are the schools being closed is one question. Where are these schools are being closed is another question. Now, particularly in coming to the school closing, the government's argument has been that the number of children in government schools have come down, that the school is no more viable, and so the school needs to be closed. Now, the whole idea of viability itself is a question, because school is not really a market practice that we are talking about, where if only it is profitable or if it is viable that you will sort of undertake that activity by the state. The state is duty bound to provide education, healthcare and those basic services to people. So it cannot talk about viability of the whole education system and the schooling, and for its reason to close. But even looking at the whole viability of the question, for one, the government does not have adequate data to say what is the number of schools a particular area needs. Like if we very simply look, our census data has one number for the school, for the number of children in our country. Our DICE data has another number for the number of children in the school. So which means there is a big discrepancy between the data that the government itself has. Government will tell you that out of school children are 60 lakhs, but some other census will tell you it is 80 lakhs. Some other agencies tells you it is more than 1 crore. So when we do not have the data of how many children actually need schools, how are we even calculating that schools are not necessary and that we can close it? So that's one question. So even if we don't have the data, another dimension is also that we ourselves know that a lot of children are dropping out of school even after being enrollment. About 50% are dropping out. So our practice, instead of bringing those children back and creating a better environment for them to study, our solution is close down the schools. So it's almost like you create a system where the schools will naturally die. So you create conditions in the school where children are not learning, where children are not finding it enjoyable to come to school, where children are not finding it interesting to study. So you create those conditions in school without teachers, without books, without basic infrastructure. So you allow them to die a natural death. And once children take action saying that, or parents take action saying that the school is not teaching and so we are dropping out, then it becomes an easy excuse for schools to be closed down by the government. So on one hand, we have no data, our data is misleading, we have a large number of children who are out of schools, we have a large number of children who are child laborers. So the state responsibility should be to ensure that schools become viable, that schools become interesting, that schools become inspiring for children so that they can come back to school. Rather, the opposite is happening by saying that children are not coming, so we are going to close down schools. Now, again, we have another issue related to this. So, if children are not coming to our government schools, where are they going? They are going to private schools. And here again we see private schools of a variety of private schools. Schools that are charging very, very high fees, providing facilities which are equivalent to facilities in England or America, and children being taught to compete in a global market. So you have private schools of that level where the well-off children are able to go. Even the poor parents feel that the government schools are not functioning well, and so they would like to send their children to private schools. Even to those private schools which are not teaching children well. So you have a condition where you are creating the government schools in such a manner that parents take their children out of the government schools and put them in private schools, however bad these private schools are. So this is again creating a situation where government schools will die a natural death and private schools can take over. The government is not concerned as to how these private schools are functioning, how children are able to participate or learn in those schools, how the marginalized children will study in these schools. So the government has not been concerned about any of these questions. All that the government is saying is the number of children in a school is less, the school is not viable, so we are closing down the schools. So it is in another way, an indirect way of supporting private schools. This whole tendency of privatization of schools, we are seeing it in various ways happening. There is really a number of private players who are in the business of education. We are also finding a number of budget private schools which are actually encouraging even poor parents to come into the private schools even when there is not enough quality education. Over and above, in states like Delhi, we have found that government is actually entering into agreement with private sector, with corporate houses to run the government schools. And in those schools, they are even willing to pay the private players for running the government schools. So what you see is a number of ways in which privatization can take over the government schooling. And one simple way is close down government schools so that private schools will improve. Private schools can come up in a large number. So you have a situation where the government itself is creating conditions for the closing down of government schools and the increase of the private schools. Now if you look at particularly in places like Andhra and places like Rajasthan and Gujarat, people have studied where these schools have been closed down and why these schools have been closed down. We don't see schools being closed down in dominant community areas. The dominant community is not allowing the schools to be closed down because they want the facilities for their children. They don't want their children to go far. They would like their children to be studying in their own communities and habitations. So who cannot pressurize the government, who does not have a voice with the government, that is where schools are getting closed down. So schools are getting closed down in the urban poor bastis. Schools are getting closed down in Dalit habitations, in Muslim habitations. And if you look at these, on one hand, it is violating the RTE norms. The RTE norm says that every child has to have a school within 1 kilometer. If it's a private school, if it's a primary school, and a child has to have a school within 3 kilometers if it's an elementary school. Now, through closing these schools, the norms are violated because these children are now having to go much farther than 1 kilometer or 3 kilometers. And we know that parents are not going to have the time or the energy or the monitoring to ensure that these children will get into the new school, make the transition from the old school into the new school, or to see that they regularly attend the school. In addition, parents may not be interested to send girl children, particularly when it comes to Muslim girls or Dalit girls from more marginalized communities, to faraway places for education. So surely this is just nothing but a very conspiracy to ensure that majority of these children will not even have the minimum qualification or the minimum education. So you have the situation where these schools are getting closed in the Dalit habitations, in the Muslim habitations, urban poor areas, distant tribal areas, and we can be assured that these children are not going to go back into their studies. So both in terms of the way the schools are getting closed down and where the schools are getting closed down, these are really problematic issues, and this surely is a means for promoting the privatization in schooling. And now in a situation where for most of the marginalized communities, education is the only means for moving forward or socio-economic mobility, and we know that in a globalized world, education is one tool or one means by which communities can move forward. Taking away the responsibility by the government of providing education, it is surely a big regressive step backward, because it means that you are not ensuring that all children are going to school, that all children are going to study. And on one hand, the government of India talks about population and youth population dividend and make in India, and that we will become a global power. So this global power, this youth population dividend, the understanding comes to more or less to say that the elite, the dominant communities, the well-off people, it is enough if they contribute and if they provide for development of the country. The rest can basically be attendees, the rest can be unorganized sector workers or skilled workers or unskilled workers. So surely this inequality or this disparity between different communities and children are going to be increasing in the coming years, and this is surely something that is going to also increase the conflict between communities. I mean, really frustrate children from the marginalized communities because they don't see a way forward, and somewhere we don't really see any commitment of the government to ensure that children from these communities are going to schools. Just one other additional dimension that we also need to look at is, we all know that large majority of marginalized parents are keen that their children are studying. And we have seen this in the number of children's enrollment that has gone up. Now, rather than looking at this enrollment as a potential and as the commitment and interest from the marginalized communities, rather the government has no interest to encourage this enrollment, to sustain this enrollment, and to see that children study. I think somewhere when the marginalized communities come forward to make use of provisions or benefit from provisions, we see the state stepping backward. Those provisions that were running well till the dominant community and the caste were able to use it, those we see them running well. But as soon as the marginalized communities start benefiting from it, start entering the whole space, we see the state going back. And somewhere the RTE Act, we all had so much hopes from it, saying that at least children will have, even though we did not agree with all the dimensions of it, giving only 8 years of schooling, but at least we hoped that it will move forward than backward. But at this point in time, what we see is the RTE Act being there. There has not been much forward movement except maybe for a few school buildings or toilets to be coming up. But in terms of actual quality learning and actual improvement of the school functioning, we have not seen the RTE Act doing much. So in some ways, though on one hand the country has now become one of the countries that has given a free and compulsory right for children to learn, on the other hand we see the state itself making the conditions in such a manner that the children will not go to school nor will they study. In addition is this new amendment that the government is bringing into the Child Labour Act. I mean, all of us know that a 12-year-old child or a 14-year-old child is not meant to be working. Such a child is actually meant to be playing and growing and developing. And this government, by bringing in the amendment saying that children can work even when they are below 12 and 14, is simply a means to say that it is not concerned about children from these communities. No well-off parent is going to allow their child 12 years and 14 years to work. It is the poor, it is the marginalized, it is the caste and descent based working children that will continue, and the state is providing that encouragement that you can continue to do this in your home, you can continue to learn your traditional occupations. It is not essential that you really come into the larger and the mainstream education. So in some ways, while the RTE has been a progressive step, we see many regressive steps around it. Policy wise, provision wise, we also know that the last budget for Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan has been cut down by about 25,000 crores. So we also know that in terms of policies we are going backward, in terms of budgets we are going backward, and now by simply closing down schools we are again going backward. So rather than moving forward, the RTE Act is being diluted and it is being implemented in a manner that it does not provide the universal education that we are talking about. School closure is one more means by the state to see that children from these communities don't go forward. Just one more thing I want to add is, like in Rajasthan, after the government closed the schools, the activists there actually studied the schools that were closed. They brought data to say that in some of these schools 500 to 600 children have been studying. It's not that these schools were not having students. And on that pressure, the government had to reopen some of these schools. So clearly the government is not making a clear, analyzed choice about these issues. They're simply deciding to close where they think it can be closed. And this trend of really closing down schools is something that does not go well for the large majority of our children. In many of these areas, particularly in urban areas where schools are being closed down, there is also the pressure of the land mafia, because some of the schools are located in such places that it can be maybe better used for cinema theatres and malls and maybe other market oriented activities, and so closing down schools become an important and easy way of getting out of the getting these lands freed up. That has also been something that has come up. I only want to say that globally now there has been reports of the UN Special Rapporteur on Education to say that private schooling is no alternative for universal education, that it is the state, it is the government that has to provide universal education. No private sector will be able to provide universal education. Primarily his reason is twofold. He says private schools do not recognize equity and equality of children, and equity and equality of children is a fundamental angle to educating children, and private schools have nothing to do on non-discrimination. So when you are promoting discrimination, when you are promoting inequality, those two basic dimensions disqualify private schools from being able to provide universal education. So it becomes clearly the role of the government, and when this is being globally recognized, when many developing countries are providing universal education from the state to their children, we have given a right to our children, but we are violating the same right by closing down these schools and by not allowing our children to have a fair and equitable means to go into education.